Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you for taking some time in the middle of extraordinarily difficult circumstances for all of you to be here today. To take the time to contemplate the future. That is showing your own strength, and the future will come, and it will be a bright future for Ukraine, and it will be a bright future for you guys, and in fact it will be a bright future for Ukraine because of you guys, and because you will take it into your own hands. So of course, in the middle of fighting a war, you might not be it might not be so present to you to think about how to find the right and the most effective policy. But a time will come where this war is over and you will be ready to reconstruct Ukraine, and I think you will be ready to reconstruct the world. I want to tell you just a little bit of something that can be helpful as a tool in this effort to reconstruct the world, and that's the tool that I've been using in my own work and in my own policy work, which is the social experiment. Note of background about me, as an undergraduate student, I was not an economist. I was mainly studying history, and I was doing economics as a second subject, a bit desultorily, but I did want to make a difference in the world. And in fact, one way in which I thought I could make a difference in the world at some point was to insert myself in revolutions that really weren't mine. You can see me in 1991 on top of a bus with a few of my friends protesting against the DKCP coup. That was, of course, these protests were the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union. And, you know, looking backwards with the perspective of today, I wonder whether I was... and maybe I don't even wonder whether, but I think I was really extraordinarily naive to think that this was all, you know, a movement necessarily for the better, and things needed to be done to go with it. There was many things I didn't know about how this revolution was even possible, many things that were the ferment of some of the things we're seeing today. But anyway, this is me at age 19 on top of a bus. Like many people at the time, I did not think economists were to be trusted. In fact, economists are the experts whose opinion tend to be the least trusted, with the exception of politicians. So when people were asked in 2017 in the UK which experts they trust about their own field of expertise, the people who are the most trusted about their own field of expertise are the nurses. Then you have the doctors. The least trusted people are politicians, and the least trusted experts, subject experts, are economists, who are the level of trust that economists enjoy is half of the trust of weather forecasters, which is quite remarkable. And it's not a mistrust about scientists in general, because you can see scientists and historians enjoying high level of trust. So why are economists not trusted? Well, there are many reasons for that. They are often seen as representing a sort of status quo that is not necessarily representative, but they're also seen as being too, especially by people who have done a little bit of economics, introductory economics, as being too wedded to their models, too wedded to representation of human beings that have very little to do with how people behave in general, and so in love with their models that they forget the real world. In other words, there is, you know, many people think that there is a sort of a choice between calculus on the one hand and real people on the other hand, and that economists have taken the wrong direction and have gone in the calculus direction. This poster is actually, this poster is actually found about 50 meters from my office on MIT campus, where calculus shows towards the math building and real people towards our building, in which both the economics department and the business schools are housed. I think think that that's not actually calculus versus real people is not the choice we have. I think we can have both head and heart if we think about what is the most effective policy in the most empirically driven way possible. And this is my work and my career. So what I do in my work is called randomized evaluations. And what are randomized evaluations? It's really taking a scientific approach. I apply them to poverty, but you could apply them to policy making more generally. So in my work, I use randomized evaluations to take a scientific approach to tackling poverty. JPEL was funded. JPEL is a network of economists which was funded by the economics department in 2003. It's a network of researchers all around the world. It has grown today to actually almost 1,000 affiliate and invited researchers. And we do three things. We conduct randomized evaluations of policies. We conduct policy outreach to share these results and also to share with researchers questions that are of interest to policymakers. And we do capacity building through training courses, both online and offline, and a master's program at MIT. So to explain to you what's a randomized evaluation, one first sort of shortcut way to explain it is that it is like a randomized controlled trial in medicine. So for example, like the test that we use to determine whether a COVID vaccine was helpful or not, but applied to social policies. So for example, for the COVID vaccine, they took about, I think it was 30,000 people. Half of them received the vaccine, half of them received the placebo, and then over time they followed in the treatment group and in the placebo whether anybody got sick with the disease and got seriously sick or hospitalized and died from the disease. And since people were randomly selected to get the drug or the placebo, we can be sure that the difference we're seeing between the groups is really due to the vaccine and to nothing else. Now, the innovation that we come up with now several decades ago is to say, well, if you can do that for vaccines, nothing stops you to do it with a real setting. So let's take one real challenge in a real setting where the stakes are really high as the COVID vaccines, perhaps. Every year, 2.5 million die from vaccines preventable diseases. Every year, and that was before the COVID crisis, 25 million children did not receive the essential immunization, including measles. India is one of the countries where immunization is the lowest in the world. Only 44% of kids 1 year old are fully vaccinated and have received in particular their measles vaccine, and it's much worse in the rural areas. Several years ago now, we did a study in the Rajasthan states of India where, according to the official data, 27% of 1 year old are fully vaccinated. However, 95% of them received the first vaccine, so it's not that people are reluctant to get their kids immunized, it's more that they don't get around to do it because so many things compete with this type of priorities. So what are the difficulties? Well, the first is that if you want to get your kid immunized, first you need to find someone who is going to immunize your child. And at least at the time, I must say it has progressed since then, the supply of vaccine was very unreliable. This is a primary health sub-center in rural Rajasthan that we visited every week for a year, and we found it closed most days that we visited, so you can see it here closed. The absence is on any given day in any given center for the centers that are actually manned is 45% in Udaipur. So that's the first difficulty. A difficulty that many policymakers have now tried to address. A second difficulty is that even when it's available, for poor people, even if they are in principle okay with getting their kids immunized, it might not be the first priorities. They need to go there, it's costly, it's painful, there is an immediate cost. The benefits are in the future, so they are very hard to see. As a result, it's something that you maybe have tendency to procrastinate about. So what could be the solution? Well, the first thing is you have to ensure reliable supply, and that is something that many governments have worked on now, but at the time needed some effort in Udaipur districts in particular. So we teamed up with Seva Mandir, a local NGO, and with the government to ensure mobile vaccination camps, which were very regularly held and monitored with date and timestamp photo. At the same time that we organized these camps, we had an intervention to increase demands with 1 kilo of lentils for scheduled vaccination and one set of plates for people who finished vaccination. We did a randomized evaluation in the district of Udaipur. At the baseline, only 3% of the kids were fully immunized. We had 30 hamlets where the NGO set up the camps, and in 30 hamlets they set up the camps, and in addition they set up the parental incentive programs. The rest of the hamlets are control hamlets. They were randomly selected. You can see the pins here all over the place of the variance treatment group. Red and blue are treatment, white is control. They are similar in all respects because they were randomly selected. Now what do we find? After 1 year, immunization in the control group had increased a little bit, maybe because of other things that the government did to reach 5% full immunization. But in places where reliable supply was introduced, it had moved to 17%. And in places where there was the incentives as well, it had moved to 36%. So what this shows is that adding the lentils to the reliable supply really did make a big difference. And in fact, because you need to have a camp and the person needs to be paid regardless of the number of kids who come to her, in this particular settings we found that the impact was, the cost per kid fully immunized was cheaper with incentive, simply because you had a better leverage of all the fixed cost investments that you would be doing anyway. So that's an example of a small, small, well-done randomized control trial. And then what we want to do is to say, well, how do we go from this well-done study to a full-scale adoption of a policy? So this is something which was this idea that the objective of research is not research for itself, but it's to guide policy making, is at the heart of why I founded JPAL along with Abhijit Banerjee and with Sandil Munanathan. From the very beginning, we thought of JPAL as being an engine for the transmission of these policies to a larger scale. And in fact, this is something JPAL has been successful at. You can see here the number of people who have been touched by policies that one of our affiliates has found effective. So that doesn't mean that JPAL had anything to do with the implementation of the policy at scale, but it has something to do with this policy was found effective, the results were communicated, and it was scaled up. By 2019, it was 400 million. Now it is closer to 1 billion because a lot of our work was done during the pandemic. So JPAL directly affected policy in numerous ways across all the continents, and it's been a successful experience. We kind of successfully did what we set out to do, and we are of course going to continue in the future. And yet at the beginning we faced a lot of criticism on the very idea that you can do from experiment to full policies. And this criticism came mostly from the fact that people started with a straw man. The straw man is like you run this small experiment like we did in Udaipur, then you get your results, then you prepare a shiny policy brief, you show it to policymakers, and then poof, you get full-scale adoption. So this might have been my hope when I was sitting on my bus, or maybe a little bit later when I started doing randomized evaluation, this kind of very naive view of the world. And in fact, it is a very naive view of the world, so there are lots of critics. These experiments are gold-plated, they are not very informative of what would happen at scale. In any case, the results are valid in one place, they might not replicate elsewhere, so you should not replicate from one setting. And okay, if you have replicated your study, maybe policymakers are not interested because it's really not their subject now. There are, there are things that are always things that are more urgent. And then if it gets adopted on the basis of your of this study and your policy brief, well, you have no guarantee that you'll find the same results, because when something are done at scale, they are very different from what you get when you do things on a small scale. So actually, all of these criticisms are valid if it were the way that you go from this experiment to policy. But it turns out it's not at all the way that you go from experiment to policy. Going policy influence doesn't work that way in many ways. So first of all, you do not do one experiment and then try to scale up. First of all, you don't really come to a conclusion before you have many studies. Let me show you just one example, which is the example of microcredit. So you see here a woman, I think she's in Georgia, I think, and she just, she has started a small business with microcredit. In the 2000s, microcredit was everywhere. Mohammed Yunus got the Nobel Prize. It was the thing that was going to change the world. Then the tone shifted, and you started getting critical article about microcredit. Even they were accused of potentially leading to farmer suicide by putting too much pressure for them to reimburse. But then, in the meantime, so the pendulum swung widely, but in the meantime, there was no data. So this is something that very early on, I was very keen to start studying to see, well, what do we really know? Is microcredit effective or not? And I conducted a first study in India at the same time that Dean Kernan started a first study in Philippines. In India, we didn't find great results. In Philippines, they find somewhat better results. But of course, India is a very specific context, the hotbed of microfinance. So perhaps the randomized evaluation showed no effect simply because people who were not involved in our experiment were involved with some other results. So what we did is we decided to wait. We decided to wait until many people had conducted several studies in different contexts, and then we published them together in one journal with the same set of outcomes. And what this means is that these results can be combined and they can be compared, and you can see whether or not the results tend to be the same in most places. And you can also use what you know from one context to get more information about what would happen in the next context. So this combination of various studies can be done via Bayesian hierarchical modeling, which is something that a student of mine who is now a professor at the LSE did with this microcredit data. And what she found is that the results from India were not unique, that generally, for example, these are the effect of profits, are very constant across all studies. The Philippines was more of an outlier, but the effect on profits are generally small. Therefore, across studies, you can conclude that all of the studies want to show that there is no effect on profit. Then we can look at the other outcomes, and generally, across all of the outcomes, we don't find much of an effect at all from these studies all taken together. Now that we have 7 studies that all found similar results, which is not very much, that really changed the debate. Because you're not talking about microcredit as this like wonderful thing or this horrible thing. You're talking about this thing that basically doesn't have much of an effect for most people, with some exception, which is the people who already had a business seem to be doing better. So and you can't have this kind of subtle debate unless you have very solid evidence that's replicated across, and then you have lots of impact on the world. So what happened after that is that the focus shifted to, it works versus it doesn't work, to one, understanding how to make the products better and more useful to people, and second, focus on this heterogeneity that showed that some people seem to benefit. So we need to create methods to identify the real entrepreneurs who will benefit from a microcredit. So this is the first kind of straw man declare. It's not after one study that you come up with big conclusion. It's after a collection of studies. The second thing is, how do you go when you know you've done several studies and you're pretty convinced that something needs to be done? How do you how do you go from the ones or even the several relatively small scale study to a program that will work when implemented at scale within or outside of government. And here, let me give you the example of teaching at the right level. What's teaching at the right level? Well, it's an answer to a problem you find in most developing countries and also some developed countries, which is while many kids are in school, they are not learning very much there. In particular, for example, in India, you can see that over time, many kids go to school, but less than half of the kids in Standard 5 can read at the Standard 2 level. So what's the problem? So many studies have shown that it's not that teachers are not teaching, it's not that they are not paid enough, it's not that children cannot learn, etc. The problem seems to be more that the curriculum is not adapted to what the children need. And in particular, the curriculum is very, very demanding. It's adapted to what used to be a small elite when the school system were set up by the colonial eras. Now the school system are much wider, but the curriculum have never really changed. So the answer to that, if that's the right problem, is to go back to teaching at the right level. So basically group kids not by age, but by level of achievement at a given point in time, and then teach them what they need to do at this point. So you assess, you group, you teach foundational skill for that level, and then you constantly reassess in order to move people across groups as need be. This is a model that was started by these two people, Dr. Rukmini Banerjee and Dr. Madhav Chaval, and the organization Pratham. We've been associated with Pratham for many years, and we've evaluated many things. So first of all, we evaluated the model on relatively small scale. And then we decided to see what happens. Pratham became successful at scaling the model through government systems. So we wanted to know whether or not this could work. The way we did this in 2008-2010 is that as Pratham was scaling up in 2 states, we carved out a place to do an evaluation. So it's the opposite of your standard system where you have everywhere the control and then a small treatment group. Here we had everywhere the treatment, but we kept a small control group. And what did we find? Well, nothing. It just didn't work at scale at all. So that was disappointing. But we had done something during the experiment that helped us make sense of these results, which is we had conducted a qualitative evaluation by going to teachers, visiting teachers, etc. And what we discovered is that, number one, they didn't implement at all. They didn't implement teaching at the right level, they didn't group the kids, they continued to run the curriculum. So the reason why this program didn't work is that it was never implemented. And why was it not implemented? Well, it's because teachers felt that they didn't have the time because they still needed to complete the curriculum. So that told us 2 things. One is that a specific time in the moment needs to be created, needs to be carved for this activity to take place. And second, teachers need to understand that this is now their job. Teaching at the right level is not something they can do to distract themselves or if they have time, like cooking project or something. It is something that's fundamental to their achievement. So what did we do? We tried a new experiment in the state of Haryana where teachers had 1 hour a day to allocate to teaching at the right level activity. In the treatment school, in the control school, they just had 1 more hour to the day to do whatever. And in addition, they received on-site mentoring by government academic officials, and that worked beautifully. We also created learning camps in government primary school in places where the school system was almost defunct. Both of these versions did work and were effective, which means that the program could be scaled up now. And today, the program reached millions of children in India. After the pandemic, it became even more important. So many states have just gone to a full-scale implementation of teaching at the right level in India. And there is also an effort to scale it up across all of Africa. Another way in which randomized evaluation sort of makes their way into policymaking is not by proposing entirely new approaches like teaching at the right level, but in a more sort of modest way by improving programs that run at scale anyway, helping the government address what I've called plumbing problems, which is like you have an idea what you want to do, but there are so many details that needs to be fixed before these ideas can be effective that there are many things we don't know. And as we don't know things, we can try them out. You know, how to effectively raise taxes, how to effectively control pollution in farms, how to effectively run a proper program, and so on and so forth. So I'll give you one example, which was actually a response to a request that came to Abhijit Banerjee and Ben Olken and Rima Hanna from the government of Indonesia. So the government of Indonesia has a large social assistance program, which is rice distribution. This program is not functioning very well. It is funded centrally, but it's implemented locally, and it's known to be quite corrupt. And one result of this corruption is that the poor receive only 30% of the intended subsidy, and they pay 25% more for the subsidized rice skin than they should ideally be getting. So what's the government idea was like, oh, maybe one reason why they do not take advantage of the program is that they just are not informed. So the government were interested in introducing a simple identification, proving your eligibility for the program, and giving you information that you should be getting it. And they contacted the team both for help with the design of the card and also for evaluation that the card does make a difference. So the team said, great, let's do that, but in order to go with the right design for the card, we also need to know how this card needs to be designed. So what's important? Should there be information, for example, on prices on the card? Should we vary who gets the card? Does it need to go to everyone? Or can we give it to only a few people in the village and the other will understand they're eligible as well? Do you need to reinforce not only the card that people get privately, but also have posters which indicate a list of eligibilities? And would the card be more effective if they had they created an impression that the government official is accountable not just to the villager but also to the government, which was done with the clip-and coupons. So the experiment varied 4 aspects of the card through a randomized control trial that compared comparison in a few hundred villages, comparison group versus these 4. What did they find? Well, overall, first of all, they found that distributing card is a good idea. Poor family got a 26% increase in subsidy, driven by a reduction in leakage from the officials. And of course, it is very, very cheap to distribute this card, so it was super cost effective. In addition, they also learned which version of the card was the most effective, and basically it's a card that goes with to everyone, that has the price information on it, and that is accompanied with posters in the village. The accountability dimension vis-à-vis the government was not very important. So what was more important apparently is to create the condition where villagers could really stand up to the official and say, look, you owe me that. After that, these results, the government rolled out the social protection card in 2013 to 15 million poor families, reaching 66 million people. And since then, they have a continued partnership with Stipal Southeast Asia with planned evaluation of many other things. Let me give you one more example, which is control of industrial pollution. So Gujarat is one of the most rapidly growing states, industrial states in India. It's also the home to some of the most polluted places on earth. Due to heavy pollution with heavy metals, with the air, everything is absolutely terrible there. A few years ago, the Supreme Court of Gujarat edicted a rule that clearly the government was incapable of controlling the farms, therefore they needed to put in place a third-party audit system by private firms. So the way the third-party audit works is that a private auditor must collect a water sample and air sample 3 times a year for the farms at high pollution potential and deliver a report on what on the pollution, and this report is transmitted to the government as well as to the firm, so it can be the basis for sanctions. Now, the problem with this system is that because the firms are privately selected, they are selected and paid for by the firms. So the government was under the impression that the system was not working very well because there was a big conflict of interest between the firms and the auditors. And in fact, what we found in a back check is the following. So this is what the audits say for one particular pollutant, which is suspended particulate matters. You're finding that this is a threshold of what's, the red line is a threshold of what's authorized by government, and you find that 73% of firms are right below the threshold, which shows that, you know, they are very super efficient at controlling their pollution, but not too much. Well, what we did is that 2 weeks after each audit, we sent a team from a university on a random time to collect the exact same data. And here is the data from the exact same firms. And you can see that it is not the case that all of the firms are within 73%. Many firms are above, and in fact, some firms are way below. And there is not this, we have only 19% of firms that are very close to the threshold. So basically, the reason why all of the official reports from the auditors are close to the threshold is because the auditors lie. So what we did is we proposed a reform to the government to implement better the scheme that they wanted to implement anyway. This is what with Michael Greenstone and Rohini Pandey and Nick Ryan. What we did is said, look, have the auditor be randomly assigned and receive a fixed payment from a central pool, back check the auditor for accuracy, and pay them either a premium or continuation in the scheme on the basis of accuracy. And here's what we found when we did that. So this is the audit in the treatment group, 39%, compared to the back check, 14%. So most of this excess mass is gone, and you can now see that in the audit in the treatment group, we found firms that are very polluted, and that led eventually to a reduction in pollution. So that's an example about how sort of in the regular day-to-day basis, experiments are not something that you do separately and then you wait for a few years for the result and you bring back. Experiments are a partnership of policy makings. Many governments have launched, in fact, officially this type of long-run partnership with their own learning unit, for example, the Minelu Lab in Peru. The World Bank supports hundreds of RCT and training with various governments. So the hope is that one day, in some sense, an institution like JPAL might become irrelevant simply because every government will do their own work. Let me stop here because I'm sure you have questions and I'll be happy to take them.
You can go on.
No, I'm done.
Okay. So, all right. We have some question. In the first experiment, you were able to increase vaccination by 36%, but the cost of this process, was very high. In how many years will such investment pay off and become cheaper?
Actually, it's in this particular instance, it pays for itself immediately. Compared to a situation where you are willing to improve the infrastructure anyways. So in this situation, providing incentive is cheaper than not providing incentive. The reason is that you need to, if you run a vaccination clinics anyways, you need to pay the nurse to run the clinic. And you need to have the cold chain to send the vaccine, and all of that are fixed costs. So you need to pay this fixed cost regardless of you immunized one child or 100 children. So what happened with the incentive is that they brought many more children to the camps, both from that village but also from neighboring villages. So at each camp they immunized many more kids than they would otherwise have been. So even though you're giving an incentive, and even if you count the incentive as a cost, the total cost you've been spending divided by the number of kids you have, adding the fixed cost plus the variable cost, is lower than if you don't give the incentive. So in this particular instance, it pays for itself immediately. It's not always true. It basically depends how many people you have to pay that would have done it anyways. So in other settings, I've found that it is not cost effective in places that are already a lot of immunization around. But it is immediately cost effective in places where immunization is low, both because the effects are larger and because you don't have very many, what we call in economics, inframarginal children who would have been vaccinated anyways.
All right, thank you. And in one of the experiments, people from different cultures come and teach the educational system. Does it affect the culture?
Oh, so you're thinking about, for example, the India team going to implement their program, the program in Africa. So this is actually something that happens all the time, right? Where ideas get globalized and ideas circulate. We don't really think much about it when it's, I don't know, a technology like Twitter or Facebook or Telegram or whatever that suddenly found itself in India or in Africa. But it happens, this exchange of technology, programs, ideas happens all the time. What is really striking in this case and interesting is that it's a south to south transfer. So this is something that was developed in India that was subsequently adopted in Africa. One of the early adoption in Africa was in Ghana, and actually there was a lot of exchange of knowledge before the adoption took place in Ghana. So the Ghana team came to India, the India team went to Ghana, and they kind of could see how their systems were working and how different they were and so on and so forth. And you note that before there was an implementation at scale of teaching at the right level in Africa, there was also a randomized control trial in Africa, in Ghana. Now, the reason why in this particular instance it translates quite well is that the problems are very similar for similar reasons, which is both most of Africa and India have inherited their educational system from British colonial at least Anglophone Africa, and then French Africa has inherited from France or Belgium. The educational system have been inherited from the colonial era. They have been set up in very similar ways, with very similar problems once the education system were expanded. So the same difficulties lead to the same kind of impacts, which are poor learning outcomes, despite the fact that most kids go to school, and the same kind of solution work similarly well.
Okay.
In this instance, that doesn't mean that they also don't have their separate different problems. For example, there is a whole question of learning in different languages that poses themselves differently in different countries.
All right. Okay. The next question, in your opinion, how the access of quality higher education is linked to the country's ability to get out of poverty?
I think so. This is something that was, that's a permanent kind of debate on higher education versus what's happening in the lower grade. I do think that so first of all, we don't know because there aren't been great data. You can compare countries with more access to education, to higher education, but they are different in many other ways. So it's hard to find out. Second of all, however, the problem, even when you move from primary education to secondary education, and even more when you move from secondary to tertiary education, is that it is extraordinarily expensive to provide decent quality secondary or tertiary education. It is extremely expensive because you need teachers who are competing with, the government or whoever pays them is competing with the economy. And the more an economy is growing fast and therefore is in need of educated workers, the more the teachers themselves are in high demand in the rest of the economy. So it's a race that is pretty difficult to win. Whereas at the primary level, it can be extraordinarily cheap because it doesn't require a highly competitive person, a tech engineer or whatnot, to teach a primary school. the moment you get into the idea of subsidizing tertiary or even secondary education, you get into this big tension of potential impact of doing that versus equity, because you can't do it at scale because that's too expensive for these countries, and if you do it on a small way and you subsidize it heavily, you end up subsidizing people who can afford it anyway. So for example, if you take India, rich parents spend a ton of money on primary school and secondary school in the private sector in order for their kids to be ready for incredibly competitive exams and to get access to free tertiary education. So in the end, the free tertiary education is only paying for the richest of the kids who have been able to qualify into the system. And the poorer kids actually pay for tertiary education of lower quality because they cannot qualify in a high quality tertiary education. So it's complicated. Doesn't mean it doesn't have to be done, but the only way to have a mass of people who are ready for the challenges of secondary and tertiary education is to have a good primary education system, and then to subsidize that and to have it a super high quality. So I think that's the basis on which everything needs to be set up, and in most of these countries it's not there yet.
All right, the next one from Sophia. What is, in your opinion, is the alternative to microfinance that is potentially more effective and impactful on community wealth, education, or women empowerment?
So first of all, let me rephrase the question and think in terms of an alternative to microcredit. It's microcredit that has been shown to be extraordinarily ineffective. But there are many things that microfinance organizations do now besides microcredit, or that organizations that do to provide access to finance to the poor that is effective. One of them, which is pretty essential, is payment systems. So I think something that has been effective is to offer people the ability to send each other money or to pay through their cell phones. It started in Kenya with the first cell phone based payment system. It's now in several countries. It was also the basis and the infrastructure of successful social protection systems during the COVID crisis, for example in Togo, where they quickly moved to a quasi-universal transfer system in the affected region because they had the infrastructure of a cell phone payment system. So it's really, when we think about the ineffectiveness of microcredit, we shouldn't conclude from that the poor don't need access to financial services. They do. They need to access to payment services. They need to access to good saving options and to insurance, although that is also quite difficult to market and to offer to people. Beyond microfinance, there is no. I mean, I think that the lesson you want to take from these microcredit papers is that you should always beware of magic bullets. There is not going to be one solution to all the problem of the communities. And the way the question was phrased, I could come up with like 10 or 20 different programs that affect gender empowerment. For example, giving a woman a seat in local village councils, having set aside and quota for women in government. That's good. That has been shown to affect women empowerment, but I don't want to say, well, therefore that's the one thing we should do and that's it. One should do that and other things. So it's always going to be not one silver bullet, but a lot of silver pellets. And each of these silver pellets needs to be carefully crafted to the problem at hand. I think that the spirit you want to have, and I think it's going to be important also for you guys moving forward as you rebuild your economy, hopefully very soon, is to not say there is the one thing, that's the one idea, that's the solution to everything, but it's a combination of you have to narrow down to each specific problems and what the solution to this particular problem, what are the solutions to this particular problem, and then evaluate them rigorously and not let yourself be carried out by intuition or enthusiasm or you know, kind of a priori reasoning of this has to work.
All right, and the last one question. Elon Musk promised 6 billion for the United Nations if they give a plan to solve world poverty. Is it even possible for such a small amount of money? I think it's too tiny.
Elon Musk promises all sorts of things, so I think the best is he promised to buy Twitter and he didn't even yet manage. So I wouldn't take Elon Musk thinking on just about anything with too much seriousness. I actually think he was talking about hunger, not poverty. So that's slightly less ambitious. One way in which I think he's pointing out to something real is that hunger is not a fatality. We could be in a world where there is plenty of food that is being produced in the world, enough to feed everyone. So the reason why some people go hungry, and there are many people who go hungry, is not because of nature, it is because of humans. Of course, the current war, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, has immediate consequences on world hunger because Ukraine produces so much of the world wheat that is being stuck there. So that gives you a very clear example of, at the end of the day, it's human-made. You know, some kids in Africa are going to starve because of that war. Not because the wheat was not produced, but because it's not going to be able to be shipped. And then on top of that, for example, India, which has so much wheat stored in its granaries, just announced the decision that they are stopping export entirely. That's another human-made decision, which is, a political, internal decision driven by internal, wanting to give the impression that they are putting their people first, etc., despite the fact that there is so much in the granaries that it's not going to be eaten before it is destroyed. So this kind of completely human-made decision is why famine appear. And Amartya Sen famously showed that there has been no famine that were not related to a human catastrophe, like a war and like poor management, even within a war. For example, one of the famine that killed so many people in Ukraine in the 1930s was human-made. It was human-made, combination of perhaps willful decision against the Ukrainian people, combination of just incompetence of trying to procure too much grain and therefore not leaving enough grain in the granaries. Which of these two factors, both factors were present for sure. How much each of these explain the Ukrainian crisis, we don't know. But what is clear is that nature had nothing to do with it, essentially. So I think Elon Musk is very naive in saying, well, the World Food Program, I'm going to give it some million and it's going to solve the problem. Because the problems are larger, geopolitical problem. But he's right in pointing out that this is a problem that is a man-made problem, time after time after time, and therefore for which there is a man-made solution. This might change if we are sufficiently stupid as a human population to let the climate crisis go to a place where producing anything will be very hard, but we are not in this position now. We're in a position where there's plenty to eat in the world, and it just needs to be allocated to people who need it.
Great, thank you very much for a great lecture. I wish we will meet in peaceful Kiev, in a very soon, and we will make a lecture in person, of course. Thank you
very much. I'm very much looking forward to this.
Thank you. Bye.
I wish you the very best, and looking forward to seeing all of you in presence.
Thank you.